This is not how dependency reveals itself. It does not arrive as a crisis. It arrives as a map of pipelines drawn decades ago by engineers who understood geography better than politicians understood strategy. A map of refineries built to process one specific type of crude oil. A map of electricity lines crossing a border that was never meant to be a pressure point. The map existed for years. What changed was not the infrastructure. What changed was the willingness to read it. Most people think energy is about supply and demand. History suggests it was always about geography and control. Canada supplies approximately 4 million barrels of crude oil to the United States every single day. This number has been stable for years. What has changed is how that number is understood. For decades, American policymakers treated Canadian energy as a given, reliable, permanent, beyond negotiation. The assumption was structural. Geography made it true. Canada's oil was there. American refineries needed it. The arrangement was permanent. That assumption was not wrong about the geography. It was wrong about the permanence. The reason American refineries cannot simply stop importing Canadian crude is not political. It is chemical. American Midwest refineries were built, expanded, and modernized over 30 years, specifically to process heavy sour crude. This is oil with high viscosity, high density, and high sulfur content. Processing it requires specialized equipment called cokers, desulfurization units, and complex conversion systems that cost billions of dollars to install. Facilities like the BP Whiting Refinery in Indiana, with a capacity of 430,000 barrels per day, were specifically modernized with Canadian crude in mind. Domestic American production is overwhelmingly light crude from shale formations. Light crude and heavy crude are not interchangeable. A refinery configured for heavy sour crude cannot simply switch to light sweet crude without modifications that would take years and cost tens of billions of dollars. Mexican heavy crude exports to the United States have declined from 1.7 million barrels per day in 2005 to roughly 400,000 today. Venezuela's production has collapsed under sanctions and infrastructure neglect. This leaves one credible, scalable source of heavy crude for American refineries, and that source sits entirely within Canadian territory, subject entirely to Canadian law, and is now being actively redirected toward other customers. This is where leverage quietly changes hands. The Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline tells this story more clearly than any political speech. Completed in May 2024, it nearly tripled capacity from 300,000 to 890,000 barrels per day. The pipeline runs from Edmonton, Alberta, to the port of Burnaby in British Columbia. From there, tankers carry Canadian crude to the Pacific Rim. Within the first 12 months of operation, crude exports through British Columbia surged sixfold. Nearly half of the marine exports went to countries other than the United States. China became the dominant destination. The pricing differential between Western Canadian Select and the American benchmark West Texas Intermediate narrowed from $18 per barrel to under $10. What this means, structurally, is that Canadian producers now have a genuine alternative customer base. Before Trans Mountain, roughly 96% of Canadian crude went to the United States. The dependency was mutual but asymmetric. Canada needed the American market because it had no other way to move oil. America needed Canadian crude because its refineries had no other way to process it. Both sides were locked in. Trans Mountain broke one side of that lock. Canadian producers can now redirect volumes to Asia. The American need for Canadian crude remains unchanged. The Canadian need for American buyers has diminished. In any negotiation about energy terms, prices, or access, that asymmetry is now reversed. The electricity dimension adds another layer that is almost never discussed in trade negotiations, but operates with quiet force. Canada exports electricity to the United States through 86 international power lines. In 2023, those exports totaled 49 terawatt hours. The provinces of Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, and Ontario are the primary exporters. New England, New York, Michigan, and Minnesota are the primary receivers. These regions depend on Canadian hydroelectric power for a significant portion of their grid stability. Hydroelectric power is not like thermal generation. It cannot be replicated quickly. It cannot be substituted overnight. The dams that produce it were built over decades. The transmission infrastructure connecting them to American grids was built over decades. When Canada's hydroelectric output declines, as it did significantly in 2025 due to drought conditions, the effect on American grid prices is immediate and visible. Electricity exports to the United States fell roughly 30% year over year in multiple months of 2025. In those same months, American states that depend on Canadian power saw wholesale electricity prices spike. The drought was not strategic, but it revealed something that strategic minds immediately understood. The infrastructure exists, the dependency exists, the potential for disruption exists. Whether that potential is exercised through weather or through policy is a different question entirely. Natural gas completes the three-legged structure. Canada has supplied virtually all of the natural gas that the United States imports by pipeline for decades. Until June 2025, every single molecule of Canadian natural gas exported went to the United States. There was no alternative market, no alternative buyer. The dependency was total on both sides. Then LNG Canada began operations in Kitimat, British Columbia. On June 30th, 2025, the first cargo of liquefied natural gas departed for global markets. The facility, representing a $40 billion investment, can export 14 million tons of natural gas annually. The first cargo sailed to South Korea. Subsequent shipments went to Japan, China, and other Asian markets. Canada had entered the global LNG export market for the first time in its history. This changed the natural gas equation in the same way Trans Mountain changed the crude oil equation. Canadian natural gas producers now have customers beyond the United States. The lock-in that defined their relationship for generations has been broken. American dependence on Canadian natural gas remains. Canadian dependence on American buyers has begun to dissolve. This is not a crisis, it is a reordering. The speed at which Canadian energy infrastructure has diversified is historically unusual. Trans Mountain completed in 2024. LNG Canada began exports in 2025. Crude oil exports to non-American markets reached nearly 400,000 barrels per day by early 2025, up from 80,000 barrels a year before. The trajectory is not slowing. 7 additional LNG projects are in various stages of development in British Columbia, representing potential additional capacity of over 50 million tons per annum and capital investment approaching $109 billion. Each new export terminal, each new pipeline to Tidewater, each new long-term supply agreement with Asian buyers makes the Canadian energy system less dependent on American markets. And each reduction in Canadian dependency represents an increase in Canadian leverage over the bilateral relationship. American policymakers built their energy security assumptions on a foundation that seemed permanent. Canada had nowhere else to sell. American refineries had nowhere else to buy. The relationship was locked by geography, infrastructure, and mutual need. Disruption was inconceivable. But the foundation was not as permanent as it appeared. It was permanent only as long as Canadian producers had no alternative exit. The moment an exit was built, the entire architecture of the relationship shifted. Not because anyone changed the rules, because the physical infrastructure that enforced the rules was quietly replaced by infrastructure that offered choice. The Midwest refineries still need heavy crude. They will need it tomorrow and next year and for decades beyond that. That need has not changed. What has changed is that the supplier now has options. The supplier can sell to Asia at competitive prices. The supplier can redirect volumes away from markets that impose tariffs, create political uncertainty, or treat energy relationships as leverage rather than partnership. The 1973 oil embargo is frequently cited as the moment the world learned that energy could be weaponized. But that analogy misses the structural difference in what is happening now. The 1973 embargo was temporary. It was a political gesture designed to create short-term pressure. The infrastructure changes. Canada made between 2024 and 2025 are permanent. Pipelines do not disappear. LNG terminals do not close. Supply agreements with Asian buyers do not dissolve because American politicians change their minds. This is where power stops explaining itself. The transformation from captive supplier to strategic resource controller happened without any single dramatic event. No treaty was signed, no embargo was declared, no war was fought. What happened was quieter and more durable. Infrastructure was built, markets were opened, agreements were signed. The geography that once trapped Canadian energy in American pipelines was supplemented by new geography that pointed Canadian energy toward the Pacific. American consumers still buy gasoline refined from Canadian crude. American homes in New England still heat through winters with electricity generated in Quebec. American manufacturers still consume natural gas that flows south from Alberta. The flows have not stopped. The dependency has not ended. What has ended is the assumption that these flows were permanent, guaranteed, and beyond Canadian control. They were never beyond Canadian control. They were simply never tested. The tariff disputes, the political confrontations, the trade negotiations of 2025 provided the test. And the test revealed that Canadian energy infrastructure had quietly built the capacity to respond. The implications for American energy security planning extend far beyond bilateral trade statistics. Every defense budget that assumed Canadian energy was free of political risk must now be revised. Every industrial policy that assumed stable input costs from Canadian crude must now account for price volatility driven by Canadian export decisions. Every grid reliability plan that assumed Canadian hydroelectric exports were a permanent feature of the American energy landscape must now incorporate scenarios where those exports are reduced or redirected. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, maintained by the United States government precisely for supply disruptions, was designed for wars and embargoes. It was not designed for the quiet redirection of supply toward better paying customers in Asia. It cannot solve the underlying structural problem. The problem is not that oil might stop flowing. The problem is that oil might flow somewhere else. History does not reverse because it is misunderstood. The pipelines pointed west. The LNG terminal opened. The tankers sailed toward Asia. These events happened. They cannot be undone by policy shifts in Washington or diplomatic reassurances from Ottawa. The infrastructure exists. The alternatives exist. The leverage exists. By the time this is acknowledged as the permanent reordering it represents, it will already be normal. Await further instruction.